I have read the most incredible book in the last week and I need to talk about it because my mind is still blowing almost a week later after finishing it. So today I am going to be talking about that book, and that is Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close by Jonathan Safran Foer. I've had this book on my shelf for the best part of 2 years and I still hadn't got around to reading it because, I don't know, I think I was just never really in the mood for it, and then when I was in the mood for it I thought, oh, it's a bit too long, because my moods for that kind of plot and for that length of book never seemed to coincide, but I was in the mood for it recently so I decided just to go for it, and holy shit, it is one of the best books I have read in my life. It's definitely the best book I've read this year. It was 5 stars, absolutely. I'm going to start this video with just a quick review of why I liked it and why you should read it as well. And then the second half of this is going to be an analysis. So if you haven't read it and you're interested and you don't want spoilers, it's probably best if you turn off before that bit. I'll give you a quick warning when I'm going to go into the analysis, but otherwise feel free to stay tuned because it's one of those books that just begs to be dissected. And when I sat down to prepare for this video, just to take a few notes on the things that I wanted to discuss, I was just there for ages because different ideas just kept coming into my mind. It's that kind of book where there are so many layers. So the reason that I really liked this book was because I just thought the characters were really, really believable and their relationships were just beautiful. They were so poignant and perfect, and I can't even begin to describe them in any other way. So for those of you who don't really know the plot of the book, it's about a 9-year-old boy called Oscar who I suspect he's probably got Asperger's syndrome or something like that. I know that's the way he's depicted in the film, which I haven't seen, but I've read the synopsis of, and that's apparently what he's meant to be like in the film. It's not explicitly mentioned in the book, but there's still a lot of his behaviours that make it seem that way. Oscar's father died in the 9/11 attacks, and since then he's been dealing with grief, going through a lot of sort of anxiety and depression, and then one day he finds a key in his father's wardrobe and he doesn't know what it's supposed to open. All he knows is that it's in an envelope with the name Black on it, and he has no further information. So the rest of the book is sort of a quest for sort of what the key unlocks, but it's also a quest for his identity, and I think in a way the key is actually just a MacGuffin. And if you don't know what a MacGuffin is, I'll just briefly explain it. It's a term that Alfred Hitchcock created to describe a sort of object that you think is going to be central to a plot in either a book or a film or whatever, and turns out to be largely irrelevant in the larger themes of the book. So the way that he described it was like some guys are on a train and there's a mysterious looking contraption sitting in the train, and one of the guys goes, "Oh, what's that?" And he goes, "Well, that's a MacGuffin." He's like, "A MacGuffin? What's a MacGuffin used for?" And he says, "It's used for trapping mountain lions." And the other guy goes, "But there are no mountain lions around this part." And he goes, "Well, forget it, that's not a MacGuffin then." In this case, the key is largely irrelevant by the end of the book, but in a way it's not, and I can't say any more on that because spoilers, but I will be going into that in more detail in the analysis section of this video. Let's just say for now the characters are what made it for me, and also just the different sort of mix of writing styles, the fact that every chapter was from like a different perspective and each character who was writing had a very distinctive voice. So when it's Oscar, you know, he's writing in a very factual way, like just explaining his quest to find out about this key and describing his day-to-day life and activities. And there's even sort of like photographs, and at one point he goes to an art shop to try and find out more to see if his dad had been in there, and it's got pages that are like just like the test pages for when people try out different pens in art shops. It's mixed with things like that. It's like basically a case book. He's keeping all this documentary evidence together and being really thorough about it while still giving you some insight into how his mind is working. You know, for example, when things aren't going so well for him and he's having these sort of bouts of depression, he describes himself as having heavy boots, which I thought was a really nice way for a 9-year-old to describe that kind of feeling. The other chapters are letters, both from Oscar's grandmother to Oscar, and there are some other ones which I can't fully explain because spoilers, and maybe you would work it out for yourself, but I personally didn't quite get it until the very end of the book, so I'm not going to say any more just in case it ruins it for anyone. It's just a really nice mishmash of different styles all fit together perfectly to form this beautiful kind of overall portrait of how his family has been affected by his father's death. And now that I've done my sort of brief review on that, I'm going to move on to the analysis section because I have a hell of a lot to say on this. It just blows my mind thinking about how many layers are in this book that you might not necessarily pick up on unless you go back to think about it. So if you haven't read the book and you don't want it spoiled for you, then it's probably best to switch off now. If you have read it or you're thinking about reading it but you think hearing about these themes in this discussion would aid your understanding and you're not too fussed about spoilers, feel free to stay on. Okay, so on with the analysis. I am going to briefly start with the theme of destruction versus creation, which I think leads very nicely into all the other things that I thought about it as well. Destruction is really, really obvious because obviously Oscar's father died in 9/11, but there's also accounts of the Dresden bombings, which his grandparents experienced, and also he overhears an interview on, it's either the TV or the radio, I can't remember, about a woman who lost her daughter in the Hiroshima bombings. So there's lots and lots of accounts of destruction in that way. Basically, his whole family has experienced this great level of destruction throughout their whole lives, and it's something that is ingrained into their identity because of it. Oscar, however, has taken this on, and instead he is the sort of creation and he tries to breathe new life into things. He spends a lot of his time either designing jewellery or he invents things in his mind, and most of them actually are ways to prevent or limit further destruction. So, you know, certain systems that buildings could use to stop them falling down in an earthquake or things like that. One of my favourites that he mentions is, it actually links in with the title of the book. The title of the book is mentioned quite a lot of times in lots of different ways, and sometimes it's broken up, but I really like that recurring theme all the same. But anyway, I digress. One of my favourite inventions of his is he decides that there should be a sort of speaker attached to different buildings that emits extremely loud bird noises when another bird is like incredibly close to flying into a building, because he finds out that I think it's 40,000 birds die every year flying into the Empire State Building, and he doesn't want them to die, so he thinks when they get too close, bird noises from elsewhere should distract them and then they can fly away and their lives can be saved, which I think is just a really, really cool, beautiful idea. But not only that, part of that is to do with the fact that he doesn't want the birds to lose their freedom, because death equals end of freedom. He has this sense of injustice that his dad never got to live out his life in the full free way that he wanted to. And that leads me on to my second theme, which is an absolute monster, and I've got a lot to discuss here, which is the sense of being shut in or trapped in a box. As I have mentioned, most of the plot revolves around Oscar trying to find the lock that this key unlocks. And as I've also mentioned, that is kind of a MacGuffin, but at the same time it's not. So I'm going to explain the rest of the theme and then hopefully you'll understand what I mean when I say it both is and isn't. So first of all, dealing with the lock itself, Oscar finds out at the end of the book that actually it belongs to this random guy whose surname is Black, who put his father's stuff in like a safety deposit box when his own dad died. Oscar is extremely disappointed by this. He expects it to open some sort of door that will lead him into a new, better life, and instead it's just another box, and it's not even related to his family. It's just a random stranger's safety deposit box. Oscar does not like the fact that it is another shut-in space. It doesn't explicitly say this, but reading into the rest of the themes and the other examples of this theme that are in the book, it's safe to say that that is part of the reason why he is disappointed. Some other examples of being shut in the book are Mr. Black, his upstairs neighbour, who hasn't left his apartment in 24 years because of PTSD from fighting in various wars. Now, when Oscar seeks him out because he's trying to hunt down every black in the city to find out if this key belongs to them, he essentially sort of recruits Mr. Black to joining him in this quest, which I thought was really nice because it proves that kind of youth and naivety and hope for the future is the key to unlocking this sort of traumatic state that Mr. Black has been stuck in for 24 years. However, when they are out doing their sort of detective work together, which again is another really cute thing about this book because their relationship is just adorable, they visit the Empire State Building because there is a tour guide who works there whose name is Ruth Black. And they're so enchanted with her, she gives them a tour, and then at the end of the tour Mr. Black is so enchanted with her that he asks her out on a date, which again is cute because he's meant to be like 100 and something years old and he has this new lease of life that Oscar has breathed into him. Oscar has given him his freedom back. However, Ruth Black says, "No, I stay in this building. I have not left this building in years and you can't convince me to." So she is kind of the antithesis to Mr. Black because while he has been released from this prison that he's created for himself, she is unwilling to be released. She hasn't necessarily been through the same level of trauma as Mr. Black has, but it's just the way that she perceives how he is trying to unlock her and give her her freedom back. She retreats into herself, and that's sort of a very, very big character difference between the two of them. Towards the end of the book, Oscar's grandparents go to an airport because they are considering fleeing, and his grandmother suggests that they just hole up in the airport and they live there for the rest of their lives because they've got everything they need there. There's snack bars, there's shops, there's toilets, there's showers, and they can sleep on the sofas. And she says, we don't need anything else, we can live our lives in this tiny space, which I thought was really interesting because obviously this whole time Oscar is seeking freedom and he is growing up, like he goes under such a big transformation and loss of innocence throughout this book. The first hints of coming of age, like when he finds this woman Abby Black and goes to her house to ask if she knows anything about the key, one of the first things he asks her is, "Can I kiss you?" which I thought was kind of at odds with his character, but it just proves how much of a difference there is in him as he is undergoing this mission and how he feels he has to change and how he feels he has to mature because he is now the man of the house with his father gone. So that makes it an even more interesting contrast when you think about his grandparents in this airport because they've had their freedom and they've grown old and they're saying, actually, we don't like this sense of freedom. We want to go back to the good old days where we were young and we were naive and maybe we were trapped in a box, but that was the way we were happy. Whereas Oscar is going the opposite way and saying, no, I'm fed up of having secrets kept from me. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to discover the world. Another really obvious example of being stuck and trapped is back to the way his father died, which was obviously he couldn't escape the burning building that he was trapped in. And I think this is part of the reason that Oscar carries this drive for escaping his situation and his desire for freedom for the rest of the novel. So to sum up, I think you'll now understand why I said at the start that the key was both a MacGuffin and it wasn't. Because while the actual object itself is, everything that it stands for is basically what the book is about. The book is not necessarily about finding the lock for this one physical key, but it's about the way that relationships with one another can help unlock our sense of freedom, or we can shut each other in with negativity or with traumatic experience, or just generally the way that families grow together. And I just thought that was a really, really interesting contrast and sort of depicts nicely the difference between when you're young and when you're old, when you're longing for new experience, and then when you feel that you've seen it all and you just want to take a step back, and the way that the two converge with one another. So fascinating. That was pretty much all I had written down for the analysis of this book. It's just one of those books that you can't stop thinking about, and every time you go back to it something else crops up and you realise new things, and I actually really want to reread it already now, having this analysis and knowing exactly where all the connections are to go back and see if there are any hints of it earlier in the book that I hadn't picked up on. If you haven't read it, you absolutely have to, and as I say, it's just a book that will stay with you for such a long time because there's so much to dissect in it. So I will see you next time, and I hope you have a good reading month. Bye!